Afternoon, everyone. Welcome for our online participants. My name is Keith Hand. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Legal Studies, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Professor Gonzalez and Kretsch for Center for Racial and Economic Justice for co-sponsoring the event today. It's been a great opportunity to partner up with two of our centers here for I think is really going to be an interesting presentation. I don't know about Kretsch, but for the Center of East Asian Legal Studies, this is our last event of the year. So I've got some thanks I would like to share. One is to our faculty assistant, Caitlin Fleming, and our IT department, Alan and IT. They've been helping out with logistics for our events all year long. I'd like to recognize and thank Bianca Bilal, who's been our research fellow for the last 2 years. So let me introduce our speaker. It's a real honor to welcome Professor Hiroshi Fukurai back to campus. He's an old friend of UC Law and our center. He's professor of sociology and legal studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Also president of the Asian Law and Society Association. He was for several years, 2018 to 2019. He's a prolific scholar who writes on a wide range of topics: lay adjudication, Asian law and politics, original nation approaches to international law, and other topics. A couple of his recent books, People's Prosecution Review Commissions and Japan's Prosecution, published in 2022, Original Nation Approaches to International Law, The Quest for Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Nature in the Age of Anti-colonial, Full Jury, published in 2021. East Asia's Renewed Respect for the Rule of Law in the 21st Century, which is a few of the many books he has published in recent years. He's also been a pioneer of building research networks across the Pacific Rim. He is co-founder of the Collaborative Research Network on East Asian Law and Society and the International Research Collaborative on the State and the Corporation as Legal Fictions, Original Nation and Dissent. Both of those in connection with the Law and Society Association. His talk today is going to provide historical insight on Japan's groundbreaking effort to outlaw racial inequality in international law, the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And he's also going to explore the impact of that proposal on prominent Black legal scholars and activists, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, William Patterson, who graduated from this law school in 1919, and Paul Robeson, who submitted the petition We Charge Genocide to the United Nations in 1951. And he's also going to discuss related historical links among Japanese, American, and Caribbean activists and touch on some very interesting historical connections between this law school and UC Santa Cruz. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Fukurai.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. I have about 40 to 45 minutes the most. As I will go over the details of the basic tenets of my presentation. And if you have any questions on the points that I missed, you can raise your hand and you can ask me questions. First and foremost, I wish to thank the University of California Law School in San Francisco for creating this wonderful opportunity. I also wish to thank the Center for the East Asian Legal Studies, CEOs, for creating this wonderful opportunity. Particularly, it's wonderful director, Keith Hand, Professor Keith Hand, and CEOs staff and students for organizing this wonderful event. I also wish to thank the Center for Racial and Economic Justice, and especially its co-director and Professor Caria Gonzalez, and her staff and students affiliated with the center for sponsoring this wonderful talk. My talk focuses on the Japan's racial discrimination in international law, suggesting that the racial equality be adopted in the Covenant of the League of Nations, the first international organization like today's United Nations, one of the so-called Big Five nations or states. Japan participated in the conference as soon to be a permanent member of the Security Council in the League of Nations, alongside Britain, France, and Italy. And Japan's racial equality proposal made significant global impacts, leading to the rise of nationalism, especially among British colonial subjects around the globe. Proposal made a clear distinction between the nation and the state, in which nations or nationals were sub-state racial or ethnic groups, including, of course, Japanese nationals who migrated to the United States, as well as Chinese, South Asians, as well as Indians and indigenous nations and other sub-autonomous communities under European colonialism. And Africans, especially the descendants of enslaved Africans in North America and the Caribbean, as well as African subjects in the continent of Africa under European colonialism, began to engage in their struggles against Euro-American imperialism worldwide. Africans in North America, including W.E.B, Bois, Booker T. Washington, or Jamaican migrant to the US like Marcus Garvey, who created the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or it's more commonly known as UNIA, all had their disagreements on their approaches to the decolonial engagement and activities, but they all agreed. And Japan as a leader of colored race, especially after Japan defeated Russia in 1904 and 1905, Russia and Japanese War, becoming the first non-European power to defeat Russia both on ground and at sea. Japan also defeated the German Empire in 1914 in East Asia, as well as South Sea in the Pacific during the First World War. And Japan then moved to initiate this very, what I call revolutionary proposal to be instituted in the Covenant of the League of Nations, like today's UN Charter, to eliminate racial discrimination in international law. So today's talk focuses on this proposal and the analysis and the global impacts in challenging racial hegemony, in particular, the global order of what I call white supremacy, almost 100 years ago. I prepared the PowerPoint. So let's start with the background in which Japan made this racial equality proposal in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference. Paris Peace Conference lasted more than a year, from the beginning of 1919 to the beginning of 1920, the creation of the first global governance organization called the League of Nations of the First World War. First World War dealt with the crash of the powers of two sides. One is the Allied powers and Central powers. And our powers included UK and France, United States, even though US participated in 1917, Italy and Japan. And then the Central powers included mainly Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as Ottoman Empire. After the First World War, those empires had been occupied. In the case of Ottoman Empire, it had been partitioned and placed under so-called mandate system created by League of Nations. And if you recall your history, you have a mandate A through mandate C, and mandate A created these colonial compartments that partitioned the Ottoman Empire in Middle East. So basically Britain has used League of Nations to create this mandate system to create British colonial compartments in the Middle East, in creating or partitioning Ottoman Empire into colonial compartments such as Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Over those decades, the Transjordan moved into Jordan, and Palestine, since 1948, moved into Israel. And France also used the mandate system to partition and control the oil-rich regions in creating Syria and, of course, Lebanon, which we listened to all the bombardment made by the state next to it. Japan's racial proposal was made in the midst of those changes taking place globally, the shift in the global powers, and according to the blueprints laid out by UK and with assistance of US. So it's quite important that it challenged the UK global order. Because if you look at the global map, which I will show you shortly, about a quarter of the Earth surface had been occupied by UK. And also, if you look at the global populations, about close to a quarter of the global population about 100 years ago were the colonial subjects of British Empire. So Britain had the tremendous power over the world. And this racial proposal has challenged the system that the UK has used in colonizing the world. It's English settler colonialism, later it moved into British settler colonialism. And as you have seen, one of the prime examples of the imposition of the British settler colonialism in the United States, it had two-legged colonial policies imposed on the colonial subjects. One is the Indigenous genocide, and you don't see many or only people hanging around in the downtown. That's one leg of the colonial policies proposed under the first English settler colonialism, the British settler colonialism. The second is the massive enslavement. In North America, Africans were being used as slaves to produce wealth for the class of settlers. So in promoting the English settler colonialism, the construct of whiteness was quite important in creating a European or pan-religious militarized identity in not only annihilating the indigenous populations, but also maintaining the slave system in the United States. So concept of whiteness was quite important on the British settler colonial program. In 2 months, I have a chance to visit Barbados with the help of many scholars. I traced how this concept of white was built into the British Barbados. And I, again, with the suggestion of many other scholars, traced into the 1681 Labor Code adopted by Barbados Assembly, which had for the first time used the white to designate not only Irish people, but servants, or Scottish, or Welsh, but also it began to integrate other groups such as conversos. Those are Jewish people who fled Spanish Inquisition since 1492, as well as Moriscos, the Muslim converts that Spain had decided to expel the Muslims in 1609. And those Moriscos also fled to the Barbados and many other British colonies because Britain had signed the treaty with the Moroccan Kingdom, 1591, and to create the Muslim and Protestant alliance. So if you look at the Shakespearean plays, and all of a sudden you begin to see the kind of emergence of the dark people in the Shakespearean tragedy, like Othello, for instance. Othello is the African Muslim general. And again, that reflect the kinds of policies adopted by England in incorporating the Muslim into their colonial domain. And also, if you like the Shakespearean play of Merchants of Venice, one of the suitors for the heroine is also a Moroccan prince. And so you began to see the integration of those African Muslims into the popular culture, so to speak. They didn't have any SNS or any other computer networks. But nonetheless, Shakespeare has actually reflected, his work reflected some of those domains of the settler-colonial policies in the formation of an alliance across different religious groups and ethnic groups. That's how whiteness was being invented. It's quite an important concept that Britain has used in its colonial policy. So this Japan's racial equality proposal was in fact in challenging this global order of white supremacy laid out, constructed, and maintained by Britain. So if you look at the actual English proposal, it was proposed in English, not in Japanese, but nonetheless, the real document was proposed in English. So if you look at this proposal. It has so many connotations, and that's one of the reasons many of the colonial subjects under British imperialism had used that as a basis to engage in their nationalism and the movement against opposition, via British colonialism worldwide. So Japanese racial equality proposition said the equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, high contracting parties agreed to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction, either in law or in fact, on account of their race or nationality. We can see a clear distinction of nations and nationals. Those are subgroup sovereign groups, like the Japanese in the United States, the Chinese in the United States, or any other groups in British colony, for instance. Or it also referred to the nations. That means it also referred to the indigenous nations, in which more than 800 indigenous nations signed treaty with the US government, even though little over 500 of them are being ratified. It also called for the groups who are descendants of Africans, who are distinct in their culture and nationality. That's one of the reasons after this racial proposal had been made, African Americans began to form the group to discuss the possibility of rights of self-determination through a creation of called Black Belt Nation in the South, and many others which I wanna talk. So on the right-hand side, you can see the UN Charter. It also used race, but nowhere in the charter, the Article 1, Section 3, adopted 1945, talks about nations or nationalities. It talks about human rights of individuals, regardless race. It doesn't recognize particular sub-state groups with distinct culture, tradition, history, and memories. So Japan's proposal has multiple meanings to it because Japan in itself has suffered all kinds of discrimination in the past. So the difference between the Japan's proposal at the Paris Peace Conference and also the international law, the charter being adopted, you can see a clear distinctions. There are several distinctions I think we need to review briefly before we can get into even deeper into its ramifications or many other activists engaging for the rights of self-determination. Japanese proposal, racial equality proposal called for equity of nations. Remember, and not the equality of states. No, equity on equality of nations. It also talks about alien nationals that exist within states, right? And also it recognizes sub-state national people, the communities that also include indigenous populations in North America and Africa, Middle East, everyone under British colonial dominion. And also it talks about the law or in fact, there is no discrimination on the basis of that. That means legally codified racial apartheid is out of question, as well as the equal just day-to-day life treatment without discrimination. Yes.
Could you say a little bit about the distinction you're making between nation and state?
Which I will go into.
You're going into it later? Okay.
Yeah, great question. Very good. So before getting into a little more in detail, there's a clear distinction between nation and a state. It's quite important to recognize. Nation is a sub-community, a community within the state, and sub-state community. Again, it includes Japanese immigrants with distinct culture, history, and Chinese Americans, especially adopted in North America. And there has been an exclusion of Chinese at that time, 100 years ago. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act. I'm certain if you study the history of the immigration law, that's one of those distinct laws that you will cover. Also, many South Asians, like Indians, migrated to the United States or elsewhere, like South Africa and Kenya, Mozambique, and so on. Also indigenous nations. Africans also sub-state independent communities. And I mentioned something about the Black Belt Nation, which being advocated by the African Blood Brotherhood. It's called ABB. I put the Take Ozawa, that Supreme Court case that challenged the whiteness. The Japanese should be considered as white, and the Supreme Court said no. And the Yat-sen and Ten, and migrants from South India, and you know the reasoning, right? The Japanese cannot be member of white race because racial science at that time regarded Japanese are so-called in the race outside of the area, racial dominion. So Japanese cannot be white. That's why they cannot have the right like any other citizens have, like rights to the land and so on. But I got seen thin, used the racial science prevalent at that time. In fact, court has recognized the South Indian groups are in fact members of Aryan race, as those of so-called European race, but they're using common sense. How can the Indian be regarded as white? So using common sense judgment. So Thin case resulted in the denial of him being citizen, despite what he served on the First World War, and he survived. He came back very patriotic, but nonetheless. So Japan's rise in international politics was quite important because of how Japan has been treated in international politics. Japan's first treaty, unequal treaty, was signed with the United States in 1858. It's called the U.S.-Japan Treaty of Amity and Commerce. It has very unequal provision in it, like extraterritoriality, loss of tariff autonomy, and some ports need to be opened regardless, as well as cities like Yokohama need to be opened for foreigners. And also imposition of unilateral most favored nation treaty. So you need to have a red carpet anytime the foreign dignitaries visit Japan. And that led to all kinds of horrendous incidents from the sides of Japanese politicians and general populations. Normanton incident happened in 1886, was one of those incidents in which English vessel had a trouble and it sank. The captain of the vessel only saved the British nationals and letting Japanese drown. The incident led to the captain John Brake being tried, not in Japanese court because of the extraterritorial privilege given to Britain. He was acquitted in the British court. So there have been numerous incidences in which Japan felt that there was racial discrimination against Japanese people. More than 40 years to have so-called equal treaty with the Britain and the United States. Last one was signed in 1911. There was equal treaty with the United States that eradicated all those extraterritorial rights and so on and so forth. And meanwhile, Japan also modernized, industrialized itself. And the first major war happened 1894 and 95. First Sino-Japanese War against Qin dynasty, the Japanese war against the Qin dynasty, and Japan won. And 10 years later, the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan won, including decisive victory at sea, and also from 1914 to 1918, Japanese Empire being defeated by Japanese forces. So Russo-Japanese War was kind of unprecedented. It shocked the world because Russian Empire, so to speak, had never lost to the extent it's been defeated by Japan in 1904, 1905. And Napoleon tried to conquer Russia over a decade. He failed. That was the beginning of his decline, the power in Europe. Turkey and Persia, today's Iran, attacked Russia numerous occasions. Every time they attacked, they lost. Throughout basically the 19th century, the Russia won. And you have a Crimean War in the mid-19th century, And this time, UK, France, and Ottoman ganged up on Russia. Russia lost, technically, and they lost Sebastopol. That's one of the unfrozen ports that Russia had, which was quite important for Russia to have unfrozen port for its navy. So that's the major loss. But nonetheless, any of those countries had invaded, took any territories significant inside Russia. It's more of a symbolic victories on the side of the UK, France, and Ottoman Empire. Even 1941, I'm sure you know the Operation Barbarossa. The German had sent close to 200 divisions and tried to defeat Russia, starting from 1941. That led to the tremendous sacrifice on the part of Russians. And based on today's estimate, 27 million Russians died, but the Nazi could not win, so they had to retreat. That was the beginning of the demise of Nazi powers. And only 10 or so divisions, other ones that the UK, US, France, and Japan fought. So you can see the 27 million casualties, but tremendous sacrifice on the part of Russia. It's more like 9/11, which took place 2001 in the United States, happening every day of every week, of every month, of every year, consecutively for like 17, 18 years. That's how much sacrifice Russians had to withstand. Nonetheless, again, Russia could not be defeated. And you can see the picture of here, Russian destruction of Ottoman fleets at the beginning. And 1904, Port Arthur in Manchuria, there was a bloody battle, lasted 5 months. Both sides died, tens of thousands of people. And Russian finally surrendered. And Bakhtin, that's also Manchuria, and Russian had to retreat. And beginning of 1905, Sea of Japan, Baltic Fleet, Navy, the second world, at that time, the world's second largest Navy, lost 21 Baltic ships being destroyed, and more than 10,000 Russians either died or being captured. And for Japanese casualties, only 117. So it was decisive victory of Japan against Russia. This was the shock to the world, not only to the European powers, but also those subjects who are placed under the colonial domains of Euro-American imperialism. And you can see the pictures on the little Japanese naval ships and cartoons on the right side, the Japanese men using karate chop, I guess, kicking the large Russian man. And this is a picture of the British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century. As I mentioned in the beginning, 24% of planetary surface were under the British control, and 23% of global population were under the British control. And so Japan's decisive victory over Russia at sea and on land ignited anti-colonial movements around the globe, including India, Egypt, Malaya, even Ireland. So if you look at the history of Ireland, you began to see all of a sudden the sudden resurgence of Irish nationalism in the beginning of the 20th century, and also Tunisia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Rhodesia. Rhodesia colonial compartments as extension of the British control of South Africa under the Cecil Rhodes, and he used his last name to create those British colonial compartments, Rhodesia. And Rhodes Scholars, all those scholarships are named after his enormous influence. It's very important. The English settler-colonialism was based upon this concept of whiteness, militarized, pan-European, and pan-religious identity that would subsume the groups from the various regions of Europe, including Jewish people, as well as Muslims, and some of them from the North Africans, because African Muslims are Mauritius. Against this proposal, guess who opposed? UK, US, and British so-called dominions. So Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes, this is his excerpt. No government could live for a day in Australia if it tempted with a white Australia. That means Australia had a white-only immigration policy. If you call for the racial elimination of racial discrimination, it's going to mess up its immigration policies. Same as in New Zealand, Prime Minister William Massey articulated very similar sentiments. And South Africa, the Representative John Smart, they also want to wish to maintain a white minority rule over majority Black Africans. And the US, Canada, especially Canada Prime Minister Robert Bolton, and they also allied himself and Canada on the side of the UK and ultimately the US and rejected this proposal. So for the final vote to be taken 2 months after the first initial proposal was made, Japan had modified the initial lengthy inclusion to the Covenant of League of Nations. They have shortened it on the yellow part. This is in the preamble. So everything being decided and being adopted. If you look at the League of Nations preamble, everything there except the yellow part. That's a modified version of Japanese proposal, which was eliminated from it by the endorsement of the principle of the equality of nations. Again, remember, nations are sub-state independent communities, right? That would include ethnic immigrants, Japanese, Chinese, Indians, and so on and so forth. Also, sovereign nations, indigenous nations, and soon African nations, even within the United States, the Black Belt nations. So this equality of nations and just treatment of the nationals being rejected. Visions for racial justice. Simply summarizing what I said. And then I want to focus on how the nationalism throughout the globe. The first objective and impact of Japan's racial equality proposal was to challenge white global order and present alternative world order against the so-called white republics. And Japan, of course, has its own ambitions, try to be a liberator of Asia, at the same time try to be a ruler of Asia. But nonetheless, it was hidden behind that. But nonetheless, first objective of that proposal was to challenge white global order. Second, to empower nationalism. Those are again sub-state national and ethnic communities. And third, it also united for the movement to ask for redress for unequal and unjust treatment. Because initial proposal called for the no harms, basically in law, in fact, and including the racial apartheid systems in various parts of the globe, especially under the British colonial policies, like Jim Crow's, as US as a post-British colony, as well as racial apartheid system, which was to be enacted in South Africa. There are many revolutionaries sought refuge and home in Japan to unite the movement and try to create collaboration with the Japanese progressive circles to support national movements in their own colonial domains. And Rush Bose is one of those very prominent English, Indian revolutionary. He fled British India in 1915 reached Japan and created the revolutionary intellectual circles into the Japanese economic circles, as well as in the political circles, including even intellectual circles. And he married one of the daughters of one of the quite wealthy the families. And you can see the picture of the Bois marrying a Japanese woman. And he fought against British colonialism along with the Japanese politicians and army until 1945. And I put this picture of Curry as one of those the great achievement that he did not only political side but also economic side. But nonetheless, he created them. He married into Nakamura, and he introduced the Curry, and that became the signatory product of this particular family and the brand, and still being sold widely in Japan. And again, he's one of those refugees, revolutionaries, fled to Japan and create national movements through collaborations. So Japanese racial equality proposal decouple the nation and the state very clearly. The nations are the distinct groups within the state with common history, common tradition, language, and memory, like the Japanese in the United States, Indians in British India, and many Africans who have been kidnapped from various parts of African regions and their respective African nations dispersed throughout the European colonies, including the United States. State is a legally constructed geopolitical entity. There is no common culture, the language that binds like people, national people, for instance. What is a common language or common culture or common tradition that binds the people in the United States? US not only include various indigenous nations trapped within its borders. Many immigrants came from various sectors, regions, including those being kidnapped against their wills to North America. So there's no common tradition, there's no common language, there's no common culture. So you have to use the law to bind those people. So state, in essence, is a legally constructed entity. And as opposed to nations, nations are the community of people with shared identity and culture. Oops. So I'm going to finish up in 5 minutes. So what happened is that using that proposal made by Japan, it's being publicized and ignited many revolutionary-minded activists throughout the globe. And they began to use the legal nation as a platform to ask and seek collaborations internationally with the people to fight against European empire, more specifically British colonial empires, fighting against white hegemony. So those are some of those people use the League of Nations as a platform to petition for the rights to self-determination. Those people came from Africa, New Zealand, and Africa, as well as many others. And I have a list of people who have been transpired and aspired for the independent nationalism because of the Japanese actions. Ho Chi Minh, Nehru, Zaghloul, Egypt, Mustafa Ataturk, Turkey, the founder of Turkey, Kwame Nkrumah, the founder of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta, the founder of Kenya, and also it influenced many of the African political activists, W.E.B. Bois, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, passed away in 1919, but nonetheless, as you will see in the presentation, he regarded Japan as the leader of the colored nations against white hegemony around the globe. And Elijah Muhammad, who soon became one of those founders of Nations of Islam, called himself as Asiatic black men. He allied himself with the powers of Asia, especially Tokyo. And he called himself, along with many others, as Asiatic black men. And it ignited many of the revolts, 1919, that spilled into 1920, especially by African activists, including First World War veterans. And there was a revolt in Washington, D.C., Omaha, Knoxville, Chicago, throughout. And W.E.B. Bois and many other people from the intellectual, economic, political circles participated. That led to the death of more than 100 Africans, as well as more than 10,000 people being arrested. African support to Japan's racial equality was very prominent. From 1923, Japan, especially Tokyo, suffered an earthquake. Tens of thousands of people died. And W.E.B. Bois organized the funds, sent relief to Japan. And this is the publication from the crisis. That's the NAACP magazine, which he co-founded. Awakening of the yellow race is certain, that the awakening of the brown and black races will follow in time. This is the Japanese efforts to create African and Japanese collaborative relationship. So this is the proposal. You can see the pictures. Those are dignitaries of the monarchy of Ethiopia, sending their delegates to make arrangements of the royal marriage between the Ethiopian prince and Japanese princess. It didn't materialize, but nonetheless, it's one of those efforts. Japan and also Africa try to collaborate together to fight against global order of the racialized system. And again, those are the W.E.B. Du Bois in Tokyo, and you can see the pictures with many Japanese progressive politicians, intellectuals. And he said, Japan rules here without by your leave or prayer. And yet looking about me on the street and in cars, in the theater and the hotel, I might easily be mistaken the people or for American rebels. Japan has a special interest in the American Negro. And both of us are kicked around like white folks. And that's one of those articles he kept steadily in the Pittsburgh Courier. And Japanese are systematically studying Negro problem. We train the complement and study the rise of New Japan. One of the diplomats talked with me, frankly, about the possibility of appeal over the heads of white Americans to American Negroes. Japan is the first non-white nation in modern times to be able to supply that leadership. And Marcus Garvey said similar opinions. If Japanese can develop a strong nation to conquer a nation of white people, we can do that too. Japan is the only nation in the world today which is challenging the white people on behalf of the darker races. The Japanese have shown no white race to equal the white race in the mastery of arts, science, or modern civilization. It's also the inspiration and encouragement to the darker races, especially to the Negro race in America. This is the connection to William L. Lorenzo Patterson, who's a graduate of this law school, 1919, who became a prominent, the communist member as well as a leader. And he had very close association with the international communist activists, including Sen Katayama. He's one of the founders of the CP-USA, Communist Party USA. And he's a graduate of Melville College in Tennessee. Melville College is not historically Black college, but nonetheless, it had a history of accepting Black students, as well as students from abroad, including Sen Katayama. And spending time in the South, he began to develop the kind of perspectives from the politics, from the perspective of marginalized populations. And there are many others, Japanese, who graduate from historically Black colleges and universities. Unfortunately, we have time to go. But Sen Katayama co-founded CP-USA September 1st, 1919. And he went to Japan. He also co-founded CP-USA. And you can see on the right-hand side, he's one of the biggest communist members in the globe. He was standing right next to Leon Trotsky, as well as Joe Stalin. And Leon Trotsky and Stalin, in the Second Communist International, held in Moscow, co-wrote very important document to rise up for those who are being colonized under Euro-American imperialism for the rights to self-determination, ignite nationalism, and the thesis on the national and the colonial questions. It was written in 2020 by Katayama and Lenin. And also the Katayama and ignited, again, discussions about the communist doctrine in New York, where he stayed in 1910s and 1920s. And one of those people who participated and being influenced, William L. Patterson. And he became member of the Communist Party. He had a close association with the African Black Brotherhood, ABB, and along with the communist members, advocated for the establishment of Black Belt Nation and right to self-determination in 1920s. And he worked closely with the civil Briggs. He's originated from Nevis, also Claude McKay, another prominent, the progressive Caribbean scholars. As a conclusion, racial equality proposal, it was rejected, but it has a tremendous impact globally, especially those revolutionary activists throughout the globe, especially those under the British colonial rules, from Americas to Africas to Asians, because it directly challenged the global order of white supremacy. And some people even call it it's a beginning of race war. That's one. Second, the outcome of the challenge to that racial order was very violent. And Japan became the first state to suffer the dramatic consequence of challenge that whiteness in international global domain. Atomic bombs being dropped against civilians, 1945. And one of the reasons listed on the non-nuclear policy, for that he had to testify in Congress, and his passport was not renewed. And basically, he was kicked out of the United States. He lived in Ghana. That's where he died. And he understands nuclear weapons is the ultimate racial weapon used against those who challenge white supremacy. And third is if you challenge global order, then you will be occupied militarily forever. So Japan has one of the largest US military bases. It houses the US 7th Fleet. That's one of the largest naval fleet. Headquarters not here, San Diego, but Yokosuka. And again, you have anywhere from 30 to 50,000 US military personnel in Japan. And as you know, that the US has more than 1,400 military bases around the globe, over 120 countries around the world. So Japan is being occupied, just like Rudolf Akunin, who started the Chicano movement and one of the founders of Mecha. He wrote a book called Occupied America to show how US had been occupied under the policy of British settler colonialism, as well as indigenous people being occupied in occupied America. So Japanese people live in occupied Japan. It's one of the consequences. Still, Japanese people suffer from that audacity in challenging the white supremacy 100 years ago, but still consequences continue. Thank you.
Thank you for an incredibly rich presentation. If we open the floor and I'll be watching the chat, and we've got 5 minutes to start with. We might be able to stretch a few minutes. We have extra questions. Sally, thank you.
Thank you. It was a very rich presentation indeed, and quite impressive, the role that Japan played. Sort of streamlining to today, there obviously has been some evolution and change in terms of Japan's role for the various purposes that you've just described. And I wonder if you could help us identify what you feel are some of the key benchmarks that brought about a change to how things are today.
Well, thank you, and appreciate, and you're also a specialist in China, so I use scholarship quite frequently. Oh, the Roxanne Danbo Ortiz is a lawyer, and she is also a professor, taught in Cal State in Southern California for many years, and she published a very important book. It's Indigenous People's History of the United States, as opposed to the Howard Zinn. Because Howard Zinn encouraged the Roxanne Danbo to write the Indigenous People's History. And in the last chapter, she, which I agree with, talks about this deep history of era of peril in European civilizations. And she goes back to the Marco Polo and the Christian travelers traveled to East Asia, including China, or to Java and those regions. And they brought back what they found, because he traveled more than 2 decades. So his opinions quite rich, but he recognized the Chinese civilization or Asian civilization reflected in that time the power of the Chinese dynasty. That will create the major challenge to Christian civilization in Europe. So they had porcelain, they had the superior tea, spice, they have silk, that's a cloth made out of insects. They also have gunpowder, which Europe didn't have. And he predicted sooner or later, China will become the major power. So, and predicted China needs to be tamed. And that's what exactly happened. So Europe parallels the threat to the Asian threat to Western civilization, European civilization, runs deep, almost 1,000 years. And it's been manifested in the policies, like I said today, about the Japanese proposal and rise of China to reflect that point. And today's China is seen as the threat to American hegemony or Euro-American hegemony and the powers. So that's how I see it. It reflects today's politics, especially anti-Asian, anti-Chinese rhetoric, reflect this deep history of perils in the DNAs of European civilization.
To what extent was the faith of the American activists in the promise of Japan to challenge this world order shaken by Japan's own actions in World War II, occupying and subjugating other populations in Asia?
Great point. Japan has its own ambitions. Japan is not the one unified political group with a one unified party. It has many factions. One of those people who supported this racial equality proposal was at that time one of the prime ministers. This prime minister was actually here in the United States. He was here in San Francisco. His last name is Takahashi. And he's actually from the Sendai. Before Japan declared its independence, Japan was composed of close to 300 feudal regions. And 1868, to create a sovereign state as a unified state, those 300 plus the different domains are being integrated. So this Takahashi, he was to study in the United States, but he was sold here as a slave. So he spent a little less than 2 years as being slave, working in San Francisco, in Oakland. And he went back to Japan. He was rescued by other Japanese students who are studying in the region. And then he understood the effect of racism. And so he was a prime minister during the time that in 1920. And he was also one of those people against Japanese imperial policies. He introduced the legislation to introduce the system that epitomizes the democracy, that's the Jewish system. So under his administration, he made a proposal to introduce a democratic Jewish system that would include the decision making, the people would be selected from the community, not the judges appointed by the state making a decision. So responding to that, there are many currents of political thoughts that existed in Japan. And so one of those major dominant thoughts that began to take over all kinds of political and military sectors, they tend to be very imperialistic.
Thank you all for joining today. Professor Cooper.